It was 4 a.m. over a foggy airfield in eastern England. The engines had not yet started. The cold cut through wool jackets like they were paper. A young waist gunner stood on the tarmac, breath fogging in the dark, staring up at a plane he had nicknamed after his mother. He was 20 years old. In 4 hours, he would be flying through a sky filled with exploding steel, 6 miles above the earth, in air so cold it could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. This was the reality of flying a B-17 Flying Fortress over Nazi Germany. Not the movie version, not the poster version, with its clean formations and heroic music. The real version was colder, slower, and far more terrifying than most people ever learn. Here is the number that reframes everything. During the height of the strategic bombing campaign, a crewman flying with the American 8th Air Force had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of surviving his full tour of 25 missions. Some crews did worse. The historian Donald L. Miller, in his book Masters of the Air, documented that early 8th Air Force loss rates sometimes exceeded those of infantry divisions on the ground. Think about that for a moment. The men considered the safest job in the war, flying above the fighting instead of crawling through it, often faced worse odds than the soldiers below them. So what was it actually like inside that plane?
10 men flew in a B-17, a pilot and co-pilot up front, a navigator and bombardier in the nose, a flight engineer who doubled as a gunner, a radio operator, 2 waist gunners, a ball turret gunner curled into a glass sphere beneath the belly of the plane, and a tail gunner wedged into the very back. Once the plane climbed above 10,000 feet, the temperature inside could drop to 50 or 60 degrees below zero. There was no heating system worth the name. Men wore electrically heated suits that frequently failed. Frostbite injuries were so common that some bomb groups treated more men for frozen extremities than for combat wounds. Now picture the ball turret gunner. He was usually the smallest man on the crew, because the turret itself was barely large enough to fit a folded human body. He hung beneath the plane in a transparent glass and metal sphere, knees against his chest, facing straight down toward the earth. If the landing gear failed, there was no way for him to climb out before landing. Crews called it one of the loneliest and most frightening positions in the entire war. Why would anyone volunteer for that? Because someone had to. That was the answer most veterans gave, decades later, when historians finally sat down to ask them. The missions themselves followed a brutal rhythm. Wake before dawn, a briefing where a curtain was pulled back to reveal the target, marked with red string across a map of occupied Europe. A heavy breakfast, because no one knew if it would be their last. Then hours of climbing into freezing formation, followed by the actual bomb run, the most dangerous minutes of the mission, when the plane had to fly straight and level through anti-aircraft fire, unable to take evasive action, so the bombardier could line up the target. The Germans called this flak, short for Fliegerabwehrkanone, their word for anti-aircraft artillery. From the ground, German gun crews fired shells timed to explode at a set altitude, filling the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. Pilots described flying through flak so dense it looked like a person could walk across it. It sounded, survivors said, like gravel being thrown against the fuselage. Except the gravel could kill you. One of the most documented and costly missions of the entire air war was the double raid on Regensburg and Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943. The 8th Air Force sent hundreds of bombers deep into Germany to strike ball-bearing factories, believing that destroying this single component would cripple the entire German war machine. German fighter planes met the bombers before they even reached the target and stayed with them the whole way home. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers that single day. That meant roughly 600 men gone in an afternoon. Historian and journalist Andy Rooney, who covered the air war firsthand for Stars and Stripes, later wrote about watching crews return behind, missing engines, missing tail sections, sometimes missing entire crew positions where a shell had simply punched through. So here is what actually happened inside one of those planes on a mission like that.
A waist gunner braces against the cold metal frame, watching black puffs of flak bloom around the formation. A shell bursts close. Shrapnel tears through the aluminum skin of the plane, and suddenly there is a hole where there wasn't one seconds ago. The wind screams through the cabin. Somewhere forward, the pilot fights to keep the aircraft in formation, because breaking formation meant losing the protection of the other bombers' machine guns, and that meant becoming an easy target for German fighters circling like wolves around a wounded animal. The tail gunner calls out enemy fighters approaching from behind. 50 caliber machine guns open up across the formation, filling the thin, freezing air with noise. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a 20-year-old kid from Ohio or Texas or Michigan keeps doing his job, because the alternative is unthinkable, and because 9 other men are depending on him. Here is the counterintuitive twist most people never hear: the cold, the altitude, and simple mechanical failure. Oxygen systems froze. Engines failed at 30,000 feet with no possibility of an emergency landing. Men suffered fatal cases of hypoxia because a single hose disconnected. The war fought in that thin, brutal upper atmosphere was as much a war against the environment as it was against Germany. Survival sometimes had less to do with courage under fire and more to do with whether a rubber gasket held. And yet, the mission continued, wave after wave, because the strategic bombing campaign was built on a grim mathematical bet. Military planners believed that if enough industrial targets were destroyed, the war would end sooner, and fewer soldiers would ultimately die on the ground. Whether that bet was worth its cost is still debated by historians today. What is not debated is the toll it took on the young men who flew it. Many of these crews were barely out of high school. The average age of a B-17 crewman was around 22. Pilots sometimes flew their first combat mission with fewer flight hours than a modern hobbyist pilot logs in a single year. And still they went up, morning after morning, into a sky that killed roughly 1 in 4 of them before their tour was over. What happened to the survivors afterward is its own quiet story. Many came home and rarely spoke about what they had seen. Decades later, oral history projects began recording their accounts before it was too late, preserving details that would otherwise have vanished entirely. Museums like the American Air Museum in England now hold thousands of these testimonies, alongside the very airfields where these young men once stood in the pre-dawn cold, waiting for engines to start. Today, if you visit the flat, quiet fields of eastern England, you can still find the ghosts of these air bases. Overgrown runways, crumbling control towers standing alone in farmland. Small memorials, easy to miss, listing names of men who never made it home. A few of these fields have been turned into museums, where visitors can stand inside a restored B-17 fuselage and for just a moment feel how small and exposed that metal tube really was. It is easy, from a distance of more than 80 years, to think of the air war as a story of machines, sleek silver formations in the sky, numbers and statistics, targets marked in red string on a map. But it was never really about the machines at all. It was 4 a.m. over a foggy airfield in eastern England, and somewhere in the quiet space between memory and history, that young waist gunner is still standing on the tarmac, waiting for the engines to start, 20 years old, and about to become part of something far bigger than himself.